In Godzilla King of the Monsters, spoilers ahead, oh my god, sorry. But in Godzilla King of the Monsters, near the end, they had a cave painting of Godzilla fighting King Kong. And at first, I thought to myself, that's interesting. How would they have been the same size or around the same size if King Kong was so much smaller than Godzilla back then? But I'm like, maybe Godzilla was really small back then too. Maybe he was about the size of King Kong. And then I thought to myself, King Kong's parents have been gone for a long time. King Kong is still seen as a baby. I don't really know how long that is or how many years that is based on a kaiju's age, but I'm assuming that he probably ages a lot faster than a kaiju like Godzilla. Now we know that large animals in general tend to live a lot longer, animals like whales and dinosaurs, so I wouldn't be surprised if Kong was at least 100 years old. Kong and his family look like they're based on a gorilla or an ape, and apes are said to live anywhere from 70, maybe 60 to 100 years old if you're really pushing it. Turtles and tortoises can live up to 250 years old. Ocean creatures such as whales can live up to 200 years old. It seems that many large sea creatures in general have long lifespans as well. I mean, scientists even believe that sea turtles can live up to 500 years old. We imagine that kaiju like whales that live in the water predominantly would not have all of the stress of gravity pulling on their bones and muscles, and they would live a lot longer because there wouldn't be all that stress on their bodies. But King Kong has always lived on land, so larger animals, while they will still have a long lifespan, they probably wouldn't have as long a lifespan as something like Godzilla that lives in the water. I think that Kong and his kind would be more susceptible to aging since they're on land than Godzilla would. We know that Kong is still very young, an adolescent, a teenager, or young adult at the most when we see him in Kong Skull Island, and we know that Godzilla is definitely a lot older. So those cave paintings showing Godzilla and Kong, I mean, based on how long ago they were, I'm just guessing, it doesn't seem as though Kong would have been that big or as big as Godzilla. Being as old as Godzilla is, he probably was that size for quite a while. We're not talking about the size recently in King of the Monsters. We're talking about maybe 2014 or even a little bit before that. An indication of this is in 2014, Godzilla was about 355 feet. And King Kong was a lot smaller than Godzilla, coming in at 104 feet in the 2017 film. Reptilian creatures can grow as large as possible as long as they live, but they do slow down as they get older. So it's possible that Godzilla is, well, as big as he will get for now, and he'll get bigger with the more time that passes. The point is that he was roughly around the size from 300 to 400 feet for a very long time, even when Kong was born. So if that cave painting is any indication, it could not have been Kong that he fought back then, unless they were wrong with the scaling. They seem to be using these cave paintings as canon, so I'm pretty sure that a lot of the cave paintings would show them accurately. They've done that with Rodan and Mothra and stuff when they were in the fights and whatnot. So since they've been really good with the accurate depictions of the monsters, it really doesn't make sense that they would make Kong as big as Godzilla. And from what I can remember, that's how he was depicted on the cave painting. So if that wasn't Kong that fought Godzilla, then who was it? Now here's another interesting question. What if it wasn't even our Godzilla that fought Kong or whoever it was back then? In Skull Island, we see a graveyard of Kong species, and we automatically think that it's those skull crawler things that killed off his whole family. But what if it wasn't? What if the reason those things stay below the earth or evolved to live below the earth is because there was another bigger and more fearsome apex predator that roamed the lands or the territory nearby? What if it was another Godzilla? What if it was Dagon? You know, the dead Godzilla that we see in 2014, its corpse. We also know for sure, based on the skeletal structure that we see in 2014, that there were other Godzillas as well. Godzilla wasn't the only one, and it was fairly recent. Maybe not in our time or how we depict time being recent, but in Godzilla's time, surely. And as I said before, the kaiju age a lot slower, so they would have been around for a lot longer. A young kaiju can be 50 years old or 100 years old and still be considered a baby. And I know a lot of you say that, oh, the skeleton from the 2014 movie's not a Godzilla, you dumb butt. But guess what? That doesn't make sense. Because if that's the case, why would Serizawa's assistant ask him, when seeing the skeleton, upon seeing the fossil, if it's Godzilla? She said, and I quote, "Is it him?" Meaning Godzilla, because that's what the movie's about and that's who they keep hunting and studying. To which Serizawa replies to her, "No, this one's older." So, I don't know, critical thinking? That must mean that it looks identical to Godzilla, but it's not, which is why they were mistaken by it. So that is another Godzilla species, and if there's another Godzilla species there, that means that Godzilla wasn't the only one of his kind, and recently there were other Godzillas out there. Yes, maybe this was millions of years ago. Nevertheless, with this one skeleton being here, that is proof or evidence that there are other Godzillas around. We only assume that Godzilla is the last of his kind because we don't see any others, and now with the Hollow Earth theory being there, and knowing that there's actually a pocket under the earth where these creatures are coming from, it is possible that other Godzilla kaiju can be down there as well. The reason more or less why we know that Kong is the last of his kind is because Skull Island is a contained ecosystem. It is an island. And the island is the only place they've seen these huge apes. And there's a graveyard of them. It's not like Kong lives in the ocean where they can hide and make their home down there. So it makes more sense that Kong would be the last of his kind, as far as they know. Being on an island will also ensure that they can't go anywhere or escape if a Godzilla creature were to come on land and start fighting and blowing them to smithereens. It is possible that other Godzillas, let's just say other Godzillas for the sake of saying it, would have come onto the island and fought these things before as well. If Godzilla's whole MO is to keep balance and order, then his family might have had the same mission at hand, and they probably would have helped each other claiming territory around the planet. Now Godzilla has to do it himself, but he can't be in two places at once. So it would have made sense for there to be other Godzillas as well, trying to keep the peace and trying to keep alpha status, kind of like Capture the Flag and King of the Hill and such. An example of this behavior being the case is what happened with the Mutos and Muto Prime. So it is totally possible that one of Godzilla's kin could have fought Kong's kin, and they could have been enemies a long time ago. But were Godzilla's kin responsible for killing off Kong's parents and his species? The answer is no. The 4-part comic book issue called Skull Island: The Birth of Kong tells the story of how Kong's kind got obliterated, and it's because the skull crawlers are not actually native to Skull Island. It was even mentioned in the movie that his parents were killed by skull crawlers. And after seeing the graveyard with Kong's parents lying next to each other, it is believed that based on their size, they weren't much older than Kong when they died, so they were possibly young adults or teenagers like Kong was in Skull Island. But more importantly, Kong's parents and his kind lived peacefully on Skull Island, or at least it's believed so, based on what we see in Birth of Kong. These things literally came up from the bowels of hell and wreaked havoc on all of Kong's family. The two remaining Kong species that were alive fought to the death. Literally. Kong's mother was actually pregnant while she was fighting these things. She gave birth to Kong on the battlefield in the midst of the mayhem. And while the father tried to stave off the skull crawlers, Kong's mother tried to get him to safety, to put him in a cave and to cover it up with a rock so that he could survive. But from within that cave, we're sure that Kong was able to see all of what was happening to his parents. He not only saw all of his kind strewn all over the place, but he saw his parents die before him. Why did I bring up all of that? Well, number one, Godzilla's kin are not responsible for eradicating the Kong species. And number two, the Godzilla fighting the Kong species had to have been a very, very long time ago. The skull crawlers in kaiju years recently came up to Skull Island. Chances are, if the Godzilla species or Godzilla had been around, those things would have been toast. Godzilla would not have let those things run rampant the way they did. He would have already had a fight with the alpha skull crawler, and that thing would have been dead. Godzilla surely would have killed it. I mean, if Kong could handle that thing, Godzilla would have. That's nothing for Godzilla. But this Godzilla versus Kong battle happened way before this, and it makes me wonder if the skull crawlers are still there. I mean, the alpha one was killed in Skull Island, but I'm pretty sure there's a lot of other skull crawlers there that are probably coming up from this pocket in Earth. It's even believed that the kaiju on Skull Island possibly came up from the Hollow Earth too. Like there's a pocket or a tunnel that leads towards the pocket of the Hollow Earth. Maybe that's just a theory. I don't know how canon that is or if that's even true, but let's just say these things did come from the Hollow Earth. There's probably a lot more of them where those ones came from. So Could we be seeing them again when Godzilla goes to Skull Island? Because most likely he's going to go there. There's no reason I can think of for Kong to leave the island or for people to take Kong off the island, especially considering that the last King Kong movie, they took him off the island. They're probably not going to do that here. Since all the kaiju from the end of King of Monsters were said to be moving towards Skull Island because something is in a way beckoning them there, that's where Godzilla is going to go too. So, what I deduce from all of this is even though Godzilla's kin or Godzilla himself might have fought Kong's parents in the end, possibly, Kong has probably never even seen a Godzilla or heard of it because he would have been too young. But another even more intriguing question is, if they lost the war to these things, how did they manage to fare against Godzilla? How is it that the Kong species went on living after having a run-in with Godzilla or one of his family members? It's either all the species back then, the individuals were really young and in their prime and there were a lot of them so they could fight off Godzilla, or as I said before, they came to an agreement that they would rule themselves. Now before, in previous videos, I said that Kong probably came to an agreement with Godzilla that he would rule Skull Island and that would be his domain, and Godzilla would just leave them well enough alone because their ecosystem was isolated enough that it really didn't matter whether or not they followed him as the alpha. But being that Kong is still so young, it would have to have been one of his ancestors that made that deal with one of Godzilla's ancestors or Godzilla himself. Before this agreement could be made, there would have to have been a showmanship of bravado, and seeing that cave painting doesn't necessarily mean the two fought. I mean, this could just be something to subvert our expectations as well as to what we think is going to happen. We see the cave paintings with the two monsters facing each other, but what if that just means that they're an alliance? What if they're coming together, meeting each other in the middle and forming a friendship? What if the two are just standing off against each other and sizing up? I mean, is there really any proof at all officially in writing that these two actually fought one another? Do we see any indication of Godzilla's atomic breath shooting out at this thing? Or do we see the ape roaring at him and punching at him? We don't see that. And while the cave painting could mean that, it really doesn't officially say that or state that solely based on the way it's depicted. I could be wrong, but that's just based on what I observed. Anyways, I think it is very plausible that Godzilla's parents or his kin or even he fought Kong's kin a long time ago. But I don't think it would have been Kong. Kong would have been way too young. But that's another video. How old is Kong? I know we say he has to be at least 100 years old, but I mean, this is kaiju years we're talking about. What if he's still a young adult? But a young adult in kaiju years, especially for his species, means 500,000 years. I don't know. Anyways, thanks for watching. This has been Ultiori. You ask, we answer.